For body cameras were recording inside that room. Not one of them captured a single word. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means. In an era when correctional facilities across America are equipped with surveillance technology designed to protect both officers and inmates, 4 cameras were rolling inside a prison infirmary in upstate New York. The footage was clear. The images were undeniable. Officers in uniform, moving with purpose. A restrained man on a medical examination table. And a sequence of events so brutal, so methodical, so deliberately executed, that investigators would later describe what they saw as something they could not unsee. But here's what those 4 cameras didn't give us: sound. No commands. No screams. No explanations. No orders. Nothing. Because all 4 officers wearing those cameras had powered them on, but not one of them had activated the audio. Their cameras sat in standby mode, silently watching. That single technical detail, 4 cameras, no audio, is perhaps the most chilling metaphor for everything this case is about. Technology was present. Oversight was present. Rules existed. And yet, somehow, the mechanisms designed to create accountability were turned off. Not broken. Turned off. This is not a case about one bad officer. This is a case about a system that taught people how to look away and provided them the tools to do it quietly. This is Darktapes, and tonight we go inside Marcy Correctional Facility, inside the infirmary, inside the psychology of the officers involved, inside the institutional culture that made this possible, to understand not just how Robert Brooks was killed, but why no one tried to stop it. Stay with me, because what the evidence reveals goes far deeper than one night in December. Robert L. Brooks was 43 years old. He was from Rochester, New York, a city, like many mid-sized American cities, that carries its own complicated relationship with crime, poverty, and the criminal justice system. In 2017, Brooks began serving a 12-year sentence for first-degree assault, the stabbing of his former girlfriend. It's important to hold that fact clearly in mind as this story unfolds, because it will be used, as it always is in cases involving incarcerated victims, as a way to redirect our moral attention. He committed a serious crime. That is true. He was serving a legitimate sentence. That is also true. But in the United States, as in most democratic societies, incarceration is meant to be the punishment, not what follows it. His son said it best. He did the crime, and he was doing the time. He was coming home a reformed man. That's what prison is for. That's not what my father got. He got a death sentence. By December 2024, Brooks had served 9 years of that 12-year sentence. He was reportedly weeks, perhaps months, away from release. His family described him as a man with, in their words, a loving, generous heart and a special concern for young people. A man who had, by their account, genuinely changed inside those walls. On December 9, 2024, he was transferred. Routine, by all institutional appearances. From Mohawk Correctional Facility to Marcy Correctional Facility, both located in Oneida County, upstate New York, roughly 200 miles northwest of New York City. What happened in the hours after that transfer would end his life, and what the cameras captured during those hours would shake New York State's entire correctional apparatus to its foundation. But before we walk through the infirmary footage frame by frame, we need to understand the institution he was walking into. Marcy Correctional Facility had a history before Robert Brooks arrived. A long, documented history. Correction Officer Anthony Farina, one of the men who would later be charged in connection with Brooks' death, was involved in a 2020 assault at Marcy in which inmate William Alvarez was disfigured. Sergeant Glenn Trombley, also implicated in the Brooks case, was involved in that same 2020 assault. And before that, Trombley had been named in a 2015 assault of inmate Equorn White, who required a wheelchair during recovery. Correction Officer Nicholas Anzalone, another officer charged in Brooks' killing, was one of 4 Marcy officers named in a federal lawsuit stemming from the 2020 beating of Adam Bauer, a nonviolent drug offender. These were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern, and the pattern had a name, and that name was Marcy. By the end of 2024, at least 11 pieces of proposed New York State legislation relating to prison transparency and accountability were sitting in committee, unacted upon. The oversight mechanisms that existed were fragmented, underfunded, and structurally dependent on the very institutions they were supposed to be monitoring. In criminology, we talk about something called institutional culture. The informal norms, unspoken rules, and shared behaviors that develop inside closed organizations over time. When violence is repeatedly committed inside an institution without consequence, it stops being an aberration. It becomes a norm. It becomes expected. In some cases, it becomes a form of initiation, a demonstration of belonging. This was the institution Robert Brooks was transferred into on the night of December 9, 2024. And what happened to him in the next few hours was not spontaneous. It was institutional. According to court filings and investigative documents, Robert Brooks was assaulted not once, but 3 separate times within a span of roughly 30 minutes after arriving at Marcy on the night of December 9. The third and final assault took place in the prison infirmary, and it was here, in a room equipped with a medical examination table, under fluorescent institutional lighting, that the body camera footage was recorded. The footage, released publicly on December 27, 2024, by New York Attorney General Letitia James, is disturbing in its clarity and its casualness. What it shows is not chaotic. It is not a brawl. It is not panic. It is controlled, methodical, almost routine. 2 officers carry Brooks into the infirmary, holding him by his arms and legs, his wrists handcuffed behind his back, his arms wrenched upward at a painful angle. His face is bleeding on the right side. He appears, in the words of a witness at the scene, phased and barely conscious. But he is speaking. He is pleading with the guards. His mouth is moving. We cannot hear him. The cameras are in standby mode. He is placed, or rather, dropped, onto the medical examination table. What follows is documented in clinical detail in the autopsy report, the prosecutor's filings, and the testimony of a cooperating officer who later accepted a plea deal. Multiple officers strike Brooks in the face, in the torso, in the groin, in the abdomen. One officer is recorded striking him with a shoe. Another, wearing blue latex gloves, yanks him by the scruff of his neck toward the back of the room, near a window that investigators believe officers may have briefly attempted to throw him from, before changing course. An officer forces a white object into Brooks' mouth. Another places his hand around Brooks' throat. The room is filled with uniformed correction officers. Several of them simply watch. And then, silence. Stillness. Brooks is placed back. To understand what happened inside that infirmary, we need to leave the realm of criminal law for a moment and enter the realm of behavioral psychology. Because what the footage documents is not merely violence. It is a specific type of violence with a specific psychology behind it. Social psychologists use the term dehumanization to describe the cognitive process by which human beings come to perceive others as less than human, stripping them, psychologically, of the qualities that ordinarily trigger empathy, restraint, and moral recognition. Research consistently shows that dehumanization is not an innate quality. It is learned. It is taught. And institutions, especially closed, hierarchical, high-stress institutions, are among the most effective teachers. When an institution repeatedly exposes its members to a group of people defined by their failures, stripped of their autonomy, and denied their individuality, dehumanization becomes the institutional default. The psychology of group violence adds another dimension. When individuals operate inside a group context, something researchers call diffusion of responsibility takes hold. The more people present during an act of violence, the less personally responsible any single participant tends to feel. Each person tells themselves, consciously or otherwise, that someone else will intervene. Someone else will stop this. Someone else is responsible. In the infirmary that night, there were multiple officers. Some struck Brooks directly. Some held him in place. Some simply stood and watched. Each role, in its own way, was a form of participation. The bystanders provided the social permission that allowed the violence to continue. Their silence was not neutrality. It was complicity.
Let's now get back to reality, if that's okay with all of you. What's the tragedy? I'm missing the point here. We have 3 heroes in the room, ladies and gentlemen. Forgive my impertinence for indicting them for what they did. I'm sorry. I must be waiting for their award ceremony. And I remind you that they killed him. The whole rotten, stinking, disgusting group of them. They were all in it together. The Marcy Welcoming Committee. These were not corrections officers. They were a gang. They were a gang of murderers.
Special Prosecutor Fitzpatrick, in his closing argument to the jury, used a word that was striking in its directness. He called the group of officers involved not a unit, not a team, but a gang. These were not corrections officers, he told the jury. They were a gang. That word carries weight, because gangs, by definition, are groups whose collective identity overrides individual moral judgment. Groups in which loyalty to the group trumps loyalty to the law, to ethics, or to basic humanity. And when we look at the documented history of prior assaults at Marcy, when we see the same names appearing in 2015, in 2020, and again in 2024, what we are looking at is not a series of coincidences. We are looking at the behavioral signature of a group that had come to believe it operated above consequence. Let's return to the cameras. For correction officers present in or near the infirmary that night were equipped with body-worn cameras. All 4 cameras were powered on. All 4 cameras were recording. And all 4 cameras were in standby mode, meaning they captured video but no audio, because the officers had not pressed the activation button that triggers full recording protocol. Was it a coincidence that all 4 cameras failed to capture audio? A malfunction? Or something else entirely? Investigators have not established definitively that the cameras were deliberately kept in standby mode to suppress evidence. But what they did establish, through the testimony of cooperating officer Robert Kessler, was that a cover-up attempt followed the assault. Kessler, who accepted a plea deal in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors, testified about what happened to the official reports. He told the court he was ordered to keep rewriting his account of what had happened that night. The earlier versions, he said, were shredded. Multiple drafts, multiple revisions, all aimed at producing a version of events that obscured what the cameras had already captured. Officer Nicholas Kiefer faced charges that included not just assault, but falsifying records, the formal charge acknowledging the alleged institutional effort to construct a false narrative alongside the physical act of violence. This is a pattern that criminologists call evidence shaping. The practice of retroactively constructing an official record that aligns with a desired legal outcome rather than with factual reality. In correctional settings, it relies on the assumption that internal reports carry institutional authority and that no external evidence will contradict them. They had every reason to believe the cameras hadn't recorded enough. They were wrong. The video, silent but revealing, told a story that no report could bury. When the New York Attorney General's office released the bodycam footage publicly on December 27, 2024, just 18 days after Brooks died, the reaction was immediate. Governor Kathy Hochul visited Marcy Correctional Facility. 13 corrections officers and 2 nurses were moved toward termination. Investigations were opened at the state and federal level. Thousands of corrections officers staged a strike in protest of the pending charges against their colleagues. A strike that lasted days and required deployment of the National Guard to maintain facility operations. And questions, urgent, uncomfortable questions, began circulating inside the New York State Legislature about how a facility with this documented history of abuse had been allowed to continue operating without meaningful external oversight. In February 2025, a grand jury returned indictments against 10 former corrections officers and additional facility personnel. The charges ranged from second-degree murder, which in New York carries a sentence of 25 years to life, down through first-degree manslaughter, second-degree manslaughter, evidence tampering, and falsifying records. The guilty pleas. Before the first trial began, multiple officers moved to resolve their cases. Christopher Walrath, one of the 6 originally charged with second-degree murder, pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter in May 2025. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. During his plea, he admitted to leaving his post to participate in the assault, placing Brooks in a chokehold, striking him about the body and groin, and lying about the attack afterward. Nicholas Anzalone and Anthony Farina each pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and were sentenced to 22 years in prison. Sergeant Michael Mashaw pleaded guilty to second-degree manslaughter and received 3 to 9 years. Cooperating witness Robert Kessler, whose testimony was considered critical to the murder prosecution, received 4 years under a negotiated plea for second-degree assault. The first trial, October 2025. The primary murder trial began in early October 2025 in Oneida County Court, with 3 former officers, David Kingsley, Matthew Gallagher, and Nicholas Kiefer, facing the most serious charges. The trial lasted 10 days. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. On October 20th, 2025, the verdict was announced. And the result was what criminologists and legal scholars might call a partial accountability outcome, one that simultaneously demonstrated the power and the limits of the justice system when applied to cases of institutional violence. David Kingsley was found guilty of second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. He faces 25 years to life in prison. Matthew Gallagher and Nicholas Kiefer were acquitted of all charges. The acquittals prompted immediate outcry. Governor Hochul called them disappointing. The Brooks family released a statement describing the result as incomplete justice, while simultaneously calling for systemic reform. Robert Brooks, Jr. traveled to Albany the following day to personally urge the governor to sign the Omnibus Prison Reform Bill into law. The final officer to face trial, Michael Fisher, saw his jury deadlock after 3 days of deliberations. Jurors, notably, had repeatedly asked the court to review the body cam footage and to have the definition of duty to intervene read back to them. A detail that reveals exactly how difficult it is, legally, to hold bystanders within a group assault accountable for the violence they chose not to stop. Fisher ultimately accepted a plea to a misdemeanor charge of reckless endangerment. The split verdicts in this case are themselves criminologically significant. They reflect the persistent evidentiary and legal challenges of prosecuting group violence inside institutions, where shared uniforms, closed ranks, and disputed role attribution make it difficult for juries to assign individual culpability within collective acts. What does the Robert Brooks case tell us about modern correctional systems? First, it tells us that institutional violence is not random. It follows patterns that are established through repeated behavior, reinforced through impunity, and transmitted through institutional culture to new members. The presence of the same officer names across assaults in 2015, 2020, and 2024 is not coincidental. It is the behavioral fingerprint of an institution that had learned to protect its own. Second, it tells us that surveillance technology, in the absence of genuine accountability architecture, does not prevent violence. It only documents it. For cameras were present. The violence happened anyway, because the officers had reason to believe, based on prior experience, that even if something was recorded, institutional protection would follow. The cameras were on. The audio was off. The reports were being shredded. Surveillance without accountability is not a safety mechanism. It is a historical record that arrives too late to protect anyone. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, this case exposes the structural tension at the heart of American corrections. The people placed inside these facilities are, by definition, people who have committed harm. Society's instinct is to feel less sympathy for them. Defense attorneys exploit that instinct. Media coverage sometimes reinforces it. And inside institutions, that reduced sympathy becomes the psychological environment in which dehumanization takes root and grows. But constitutional rights do not evaporate at the prison gate. The Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment was written precisely because the founders understood that the state, left unchecked, would abuse those in its custody. Robert Brooks had a constitutional right to be incarcerated safely. That right was not honored.
Last December, I watched you beat my father to death on camera. You showed my dad no mercy at all. You treated my dad like he was an object and not a human.
If this case disturbed you, and it should, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story do you think the mainstream media failed to examine deeply enough? What institutional changes do you believe are necessary? Your perspective matters, and this community is built on exactly these kinds of difficult, necessary conversations. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe and share it. Every view on a documentary like this is a small act of insisting that Robert Brooks and Messiah Nantwi, and every name we do not yet know, are not footnotes. They are the question, and we have not yet answered it. Subscribe for more deep criminological investigations into the psychology of institutional violence, systemic failure, and the human cost of justice left unfinished.